Deafness has been a recurring issue for thousands of years. People suffering from this genetic disability are but a small minority. Despite this fact, there had been no notable efforts towards inclusiveness of these people for the longest time. Presenting to you Martha's Vineyard, the revolutionary island where the hearing and impaired sign in harmony, and the birthplace of sign language. The people who lived on the island revolutionized language beyond words, breaking past the doubts. They proved that people are not limited by their disability, but by the controversy. The Vineyard holds a deep history as to how the community came to prosper. Starting off with Jonathan Lambert, the first deaf traveler to the island, genetic deafness grew exponentially in number. With assistance from the Wampanoags, soon the area grew in population and popularity. Developing their own traditions, economy, and versatile language, Martha's Vineyard grew to be a quaint haven for all types of people. People tended to think of the deaf folks in Chilmark as individuals first and not about their disabilities, except in a peripheral way. The Vineyard and Nantucket were thought to have split from the mainland after the Ice Age when the melted glaciers rose the sea level. Because of this, the first settlers most probably came to the island before the bridge of connection was covered in water. In fact, on the island, Native American camps have been carbon dated to 2270 BC, specifically the Wampanoag people, who have settled on the island for tens of hundreds of centuries. The island's first settlers hosted a great number of deaf people, passing on this trait in the secluded gene pool. This will be elaborated on later. In the USA of 1850, out of 5,728 people, one person would be deaf. However, in Chilmark, it was one deaf person out of 25. In some areas, it was even one person out of 4 people were deaf. The coast surrounding the island held a large variety of fish, adding to the vineyard's ample supply of resources used for export. Sailors that arrived were taught by the Wampanoags to capture whales. These whales were dragged onto land to boil the oil out. The sea was the largest economic income for the islanders. Besides this, in the 1720s, dairy products like butter and cheese were exported in large loads, as farms were doing notably well. There was a period of time called the Golden Age in Martha's Vineyard. This was during the middle of the 1800s where traditional whaling industries thrived. One of the vineyard's cultures related to the whaling industry was scrimshaw, where art was carved into the ivory of whales. To get these whales, sometimes journeys will last up to half a decade due to the whale population declining rapidly. These artworks reflect the island and people's cultures. The island was a neutral colony, but faced attacks from British powers. The islanders formed the Patriot and companies to protect their land. With a long heritage of maritime labor, the people were skillful in this area. 40 ships from a British fleet crashed into the Vineyard Haver Harbor on September 10, 1778. The days following the attack consisted of burning island vessels and removal of livestock. 300 cattle and 10,000 sheep were taken from the vineyard, damaging the economy. The attack was one of the main factors for the downfall of the vineyard. The other reason at large was simply that genetic deafness was growing more numerous in number amongst the islanders, and they didn't want to continue to spread. In the past, deaf people have suffered from discrimination and was regarded to be retarded than others, but the development of sign language in Martha's Vineyard changed the situation. Before, ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle stated, "Men that are deaf are in all cases also dumb." The Roman law also states, people who were deaf didn't have the right to sign a will because they were presumed to understand nothing, because it is not possible that they have been able to learn to read or write. Pedro Ponce de Leon, a 16th century Spanish Benedictine monk, was the first person credited for the creation of a formal sign language for the hearing impaired. Juan Pablo de Bonet continued working on the development of new communication methods and criticized, sometimes they are put into casks in which the voice booms and reverberates. These violent measures are by no means to the purpose. A form of hereditary deafness existed for 250 years following the arrival of the first deaf settlers in the 1690s, including Jonathan Lambert. In the 1900s, 1 in 15 people were deaf. Due to the high deafness rate, the creation of Martha's Vineyard Sign Language was encouraged, and even people who had no disability in hearing also signed the language. The spread of MVSL started in the early 18th century from Jonathan Lambert. Jonathan Lambert was a man who came to Chilmark from Kent, England in the late 1600s. According to island records, Lambert was deaf. His children, born after his arrival, were the first congenitally deaf residents on Martha's Vineyard. Lambert came to the U.S. speaking what historians presume was a regional sign language from his home in Kent. Over the years, it evolved and spread into what would become Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. There was a high concentration of deaf people in the rural areas of Martha's Vineyard since people married others from the same area or town. According to Wanpool Nash, a direct descendant of Martha's Vineyard family, more populated areas in the vineyard were by whale ships and tourists. The gene pool there was much more diverse than it was at the very rural end of the island. She also said that people made an effort to teach their deaf children to read and write, and that was back in the days when children were not normally taught at home until they were old enough to go to school. Then in 1952, the last deaf individual from Martha's Vineyard that knew MVSL, Katie West, passed away, making the sign language an extinct language. Many Martha's Vineyard residents enrolled in the American School for the Deaf, ASD, and eventually helped to shape sign language today, which is the American Sign Language, ASL. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, the principal, visited the School for Deaf in Paris, which inspired him to establish his own permanent school for the deaf in America with the help of a young and talented deaf teacher by the name of Lawrence Clark. Deaf children from Martha's Vineyard that enrolled in ASD mingled with the mainland school community using MVSL, which influenced ASL. They attended ASD for approximately 100 years. Over the years, this school has served as the mother school in providing an exemplary model educational program. Trained and experienced educators of the deaf went forth to educate and to start other schools for the deaf all over the country. All sign languages have developed from the combination of sign languages over time. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet started the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. He first went to English to learn how to teach the deaf. Then he met Lawrence Clark, a deaf man who was the best teacher of the deaf at the school in Paris. Clark invited Thomas Gallaudet to come see the demonstration of his teachings. Gallaudet was able to convince Lawrence Clark to come back to America with him and start a school for the deaf, which was the first American school for the deaf. Joan Nash stated, Clark was fluent in French Sign Language, which, as you may know, is very similar to American Sign Language for the reason that the first school for the deaf in America was started by a deaf man who used French Sign Language. Moreover, the islanders of Martha's Vineyard went to America due to the high population of deaf people, not wanting to pass on the genetic trait any further. When arriving there, the people brought along their MVSL and influenced FSL, which had an indirect effect on ASL. Accordingly, America already had a sign language, which was possibly passed down from Martha's Vineyard, which developed from the British alphabet. The French Sign Language brought from Lawrence Clark was changed and mixed, which made the Old American Sign Language. Martha's Vineyard Sign Language resembles British Sign Language, where two hands are often used instead of one hand as ASL does. Here you see a comparison from a descendant of Martha's Vineyard signing very similar looking signs to ASL, and even though they're completely different sign languages, they look very similar.
Second, what is my great-grandmother doing? Because her signs that I see everybody else signing with one hand are all done with two hands. And a lot of them are quite similar. For example, most people, certainly at least in 1970, were signing cat with the F hand shaped like this. But my great-grandmother signed it like this, with what we call the baby O hand shape, and two hands.
Alexander Graham Bell was one of the strongest proponents of oralism in the United States. His mother was hard of hearing, and while she had enough hearing to use an ear tube for one-on-one conversations, Bell often used the British two-handed manual alphabet to communicate with her. He once said, "To ask the value of speech is like asking the value of life." Alice Cogswell lost her hearing when she was 2 years old. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was neighbors with her, and he decided to teach her how to communicate. Although she was very smart, it was hard to teach a deaf child. This inspired him to start a school for deaf children. Martha's Vineyard is the utopian embodiment of universal language and a revolutionary journey of sign language. Even while facing discrimination, one can't deny the possibilities of sign language, that of which has been revealed by Martha's Vineyard. After all, we are fine as we are made.